It's my great honor to introduce the Right Honourable Paul Martin, who, as we all remember, was the 21st Prime Minister of Canada, serving from 2003 to 2006. He was also Minister of Finance from 1993 to 2002, and he served as the Member of Parliament for La Salle et Mar in Montreal from 1988 to 2008. I should only note that the current MP for La Salle et Mar Verdun is David Lametti, also an alumnus of St. Mike's. We consider that a somewhat safe seat for this university. During his tenure as Minister of Finance, Mr. Martin erased Canada's historic deficit, subsequently recording 5 consecutive budget surpluses while paying down the national debt and setting Canada's debt to GDP ratio on a steady downward track. He introduced the largest tax cuts in Canadian history and the largest increases in the federal government's support for education and research and development. In conjunction with his provincial counterparts, he restored the Canada Pension Plan. He was an originator of the Finance Minister's G20 meeting, and in September 1999 was named its inaugural chair. And this was an initiative that I got to see firsthand when I was serving in Southeast Asia, in Malaysia. And I can tell you that the interest among countries in the developing world that a finance minister from a G7 country was actually coming and proposing that they be consulted on how the global economy is managed was very exciting to them, as it should have been. His time in office as Prime Minister is distinguished by many accomplishments, but I will just list one today, and that is that under Mr. Martin's leadership in November 2005, the Canadian government reached an historic consensus with Canada's provinces, territories, First Nations, Métis Nation, and Inuit leaders to eliminate funding gaps in health, education, and housing. And of course, this was known as the Kelowna Accord. Since leaving office, Mr. Martin has advised the African Development Bank and works closely with the Advisory Council of the Coalition for Dialogue on Africa, which is sponsored by the African Union, the UN Economic Commission for Africa, and the African Development Bank. He was a founding co-chair of the Congo Basin Forest Fund, a $200 million British-Norwegian-Canadian Poverty Alleviation and Sustainable Development Fund for the Congo Basin Rainforest. Mr. Martin was also a commissioner for the Global Ocean Commission. Domestically, he founded the Martin Aboriginal Education Initiative, focusing on elementary and secondary education opportunities for Aboriginal students, and the Capital for Aboriginal Prosperity and Entrepreneurship Fund, an investment fund developing business expertise and mentoring for Aboriginal business. Now, there are two personal connections that I have with Mr. Martin. One of them is, of course, he is a very distinguished alumnus of this university, St. Michael's College. And I can tell you that since I've come here in the last year, I've had quite a few, always men, sidle up to me and say, you know, when I was at St. Mike's, I played football with Paul Martin. I've actually kept track of this, and it's come to my attention that if everybody is telling me the truth, we then had a football program about 3 times the size of Notre Dame's. The other thing is, of course, I was a public servant in Paul Martin's Ottawa. And I can tell you that that was a time when Ottawa was alive with ideas. We were encouraged to debate, explore, and question things. There was a relentless focus on the big picture. We were asked to think not just regionally, but nationally, and as his G20 initiative shows, to think globally. But with that, we never lost focus on the individual. If Ottawa was a town that was distinguished by its brains in those days, it was animated by its hearts, and that started at the top. So I'm tremendously proud to introduce our alumnus to you today as our special speaker. Thank you very much, Mr. Paul Martin.
Paul Martin, it's a great pleasure to see you again. You're well?
Well, I am well. I've got to say that I was originally promised when we came here, we get to sit in those chairs. Yeah. They're a lot more comfortable than this.
They are, yeah, but we figured nobody would be able to see you, and they'd rather see you and hear you.
I got you.
All right. When you and I spoke by phone last week about this, the one observation you made was that you had come to St. Michael's, and you said, well, how did the Jesuits get in there? Because this was or is a Basilian establishment.
Well, let me just say, first of all, I want to thank President Mulroney. You've got to know that David Mulroney is probably Canada's leading Chinese expert on what is going to be, I think, probably the single biggest rivalry in the world looking ahead between the United States and China. But it's also going to be a country that's going to determine an awful lot of our futures as we all jockey for position. And I think that having David Mulroney here at St. Mike's is going to be a huge asset for the country. And I just want to say that. I also if I might, John, I also want to say that that St. Mike's is hosting this meeting on essentially the future of Indigenous Canada. I think is a tremendous feather in St. Mike's cap. It is, just to pick up on your point, there's no doubt that in my time here in the 1950s, I doubt very much if there would have been a meeting held here at any university on the future of Indigenous Canada. I want to congratulate David for that. I also would say to you, there's no doubt at my time in the 1950s that there is no way that a Jesuit would be within 10 miles of this place. So great. I mean, I must say that if you can break ground there, David, you can break ground anywhere. Good to see you, Father.
Well, and without dwelling on this sort of thing, I mean, it is worth mentioning, I was taught by Jesuits, and I wish that my mentor, who was a professor at Concordia University, Professor Mountgervais, could have lived to see the day where we would have a Jesuit pope. So it's an extraordinary thing. Let's talk about the purpose.
Is he still a Jesuit?
A lot of people would ask. Can I ask you, because we've heard some very passionate words this morning, and you would have missed Charlie Angus and Noel Starblanket off the top, but they gave both eloquent descriptions of the state of our relationship with Aboriginal peoples in Canada and very damning representations of that as well. I guess just with the amount of travel you've done, with your initiative, which we will talk about during this discussion, what do you think the state of our relationship, and I say our, I mean of the government, of the Crown, of non-Native people, with Native people is today?
Well, I unfortunately did not have the opportunity to hear Noel Starblanket or Charlie Angus this morning. However, I have heard Mr. Starblanket in the past. He is very well known. And don't forget, I was in government, so I really have heard from Charlie Angus. And to be quite honest, I don't disagree with anything that I have heard. I don't even disagree with what I have heard here. I am optimistic. I am. But I'm going to go into a couple of reasons, I hope, in the course of our discussion as to the foundation on which that optimism rests. But if your question is, do I feel better about going ahead today than I did 6 months ago, the answer is unequivocally yes. Okay,
what has changed your mind, if it has been changed?
Well, guess what happened 6 months ago? Fundamentally, what's really coming out of Ottawa, we don't want to play politics, so what's come out of Ottawa is a recognition of the size of the issue and what has to be done. And people aren't kidding themselves about what has to be done. But I do believe that I do believe that there is a will. I think it's going to be very, very important that we start to show success, because it's on the basis of that success that will become stronger and stronger. I think that's going to be very, very important. But it's been a while since we have had that kind of will, and I really do. I think I would pick up on the comment that was made earlier, and that is that surely to heaven the time has come for the Canadian government to stop going to court against the Indigenous people on what are legitimate claims. I think that's fundamental.
I think it's important that we explore a bit of the darker side, though, of the relationship. And I don't mean in the past. I mean as a talk radio host and as a person who is usually recognized as the House Communist. I work for conservative media outlets. I will routinely hear from people, why can't Natives get over this? Why do we have to revisit the past? I wasn't there. That's other people who did that. Noel touched on it as well, the idea, well, Natives can't manage their money. Why do we keep giving them more money? I think this is a room full of people with pure hearts who really do look toward the future with a degree of optimism. I'm not convinced that's mainstream.
Well, it isn't mainstream, but it's a heck of a lot more mainstream than today. And I think that one of the things that has to be done, I think everybody in this room will agree on the moral issues. I think everybody in this room will agree that these are not Canadian values. What you're saying is, you know, that doesn't satisfy a lot of people, because a lot of people are going to talk about what it costs and everything else. I also think that what has to happen is that the economic argument has to be met front and center. And so let me just deal with it very quickly. We all understand one side of the economic argument, which is it's a heck of a lot cheaper to educate people than to take care of them in jail for the rest of their lives. I think that's not an argument that has to be made. I think Canadians understand it. But let's look at the other side of the economic argument, which isn't talked about. The fact is, the numbers came out about 6 months ago. You know, every one of us stands up in front of a bunch of students and we say, the future of Canada is with you. Well, you know what? The future of Canada isn't with those students. The future of Canada is with my generation. For the first time in the history of this country, there are more people over the age of 65 than there are under the age of 15. Understand what that means economically. Understand what it means as to why there is not economic growth. I'm never going to buy another refrigerator. I'm never going to buy another house. Nobody's going to have to construct one. A country that does not have young people is not a country that is going to grow. Well, the youngest and the fastest growing segment of our population, we know it, is Indigenous Canadians. There are more Indigenous Canadians, the largest segment under the age of 15. And if anybody thinks that it makes economic sense to send a kid going on a non-reserve school to a lousy education on a per capita basis, badly funded, when there's another school 10 kilometers away where all kinds of kids are going and they're getting their fuller funding, then they just simply don't understand what builds an economy. So I think if what you want is the answer to that question, I can tell you that we put together any group of economists would demonstrate unequivocally that this country cannot afford not to put money into education, cannot afford not to put money into healthcare, and as Cindy Blackstock has said, cannot afford not to put money into a decent welfare system. And that's it.
Your initiative has very much been about education, and I want to talk about that. Can we talk just globally about the objective of your initiative, and then we can dig down a little deeper into what I think is a missed wording, and I know you agree with me because we already talked about this in number 62 from the TRHC, but your initiative.
Yeah, well, I won't take too much time, but let me just give you 3 of the programs that our initiative has got to indicate where I think the problem exists. Primarily, first of all, I think the education problem begins with our primary schools and our secondary schools. Universities, the colleges are doing a pretty good job. Doesn't mean they haven't got a long way to go, but they've made a lot of progress in the last 20 years, none of which is being seen in our primary schools or in our secondary schools. So I'll give you 3 of our programs just very, very quickly to demonstrate. One of them goes back to the economic argument which I just made. The fact is that historically, Indigenous Canada, if you take Indigenous North America, was an extensive series of trading routes. There is an entrepreneurship, there is an understanding of the economy. What really happened is that we just knocked the heck out of it over the course of 200 to 300 years. So what we decided we would do was to set up an entrepreneurship course, teaching these young people what business was all about, based on their own understanding. So we started on a reserve school in Thunder Bay. The school, which many of you know, is subject to all of those inquests, and basically teaching entrepreneurship. It's a high school course, grades 11 and 12. Course was done. We hired a young Cree teacher to help us put the thing together, but it's pretty well a standard Ontario business course. Course was a big success. We took it into another school, one in Winnipeg, Children of the Earth. It was a success. So it was starting to go along until one day, a young boy, a Cree, came to me and he said, "Mr. Martin, I really like this course. It's really working well." But he said, "How come all of the examples in the course are in Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, and all the examples are white?" And all of a sudden, when you feel like an idiot, the light went on. I said, "My God." And so what we did is we took 2 of our teachers and we said, with a major publishing company, and they went aside and they took a year and a half and they produced the first set of workbooks and textbooks teaching entrepreneurship and the economy within the context of reserves, within all of the examples were Indigenous. 4 years later, we were in 48 schools across the country. It just took off like that. So what it essentially says is, number one, if you're going to teach somebody, teach them within their own cultural background. That's one course. Second course, which we started a year and a half ago, we took, well, no, 3 years ago, we took a year and a half. And if you're a principal in a school in northern Saskatchewan or northern Ontario, then you don't have a Ministry of Education. Federal government has no Department of Education. You don't have any other schools to talk to. You're all by yourself. And so what we did is we got 13 Indigenous experts. We got OISE, the University Faculty of Education. We took a year and a half, and we prepared a principal's course to be delivered online. And we've just completed the first year. We're going into the second year. The course has been a phenomenal success. We're inundated with requests from across the country. We're going to give it to the universities to deliver. And what it shows is that there is a massive desire from the Indigenous teachers, to basically improve their act. And if you reach out to provide that, it will be there. And then the last example that I would give you, and I think this really goes to the heart of it. This goes to the other side of those people who say to you, well, what are we wasting this money for? What are we doing it? If you can't read or write, and if there's any teachers in here, they will know this better than I ever could. If you can't read or write by the end of grade 3, the numbers show very clearly that you probably will not graduate from high school because you get passed into grade 4, 5, and 6 without learning to read, and eventually you will drop out. Province of Ontario, 20 years ago, had the worst literacy record of any province, any jurisdiction in Canada, or in North America. And so what the government did is they brought in a whole bunch of specialists. They took the 100 worst grade schools in Ontario, and they had set in place a 4-year program. Today, Ontario has the highest literacy rate of any jurisdiction in Ontario. So I went to see Kathleen Wynne, who at that time was the Minister of Education, and I said, we'd like the program, let me have the program, and we're going to hire the people who delivered it. And we went into 2 on-reserve schools in southwestern Ontario, Kettle and Stony Point and Walpole Island. Now, Ontario now has, this is the Ontario standard for reading at the end of grade 3. The average for Ontario, 70% of Ontario kids at the end of grade 3 can read at the Ontario standard. On reserve, it's anywhere from 0 to 15. In the 2 reserves that we went in, 13% of the kids in those 2 reserves could read at the Ontario standard. So what we did is we went into the 2 schools. We basically said to the chief and the principals, now we're going to adapt this program. This is not downtown Mississauga. We got to adapt the program, but we're going to deliver it. We delivered it for 4 years with these 2 people. At the end of the 4th year, OISE, Faculty of Education in Toronto, did the testing, okay? At the end of 4 years, we were at 13% at the beginning. Our kids were at 67%. And at the end of the 5th year, 81% of the kids in our 2 schools. In other words, at those 2 schools, reserve schools, there are more kids able to read at the standard level than there are in Ontario. Now, what that and what it demonstrates, and it was one of the most emotional days of my life, the chief of the Kettle and Stony Point band, the tears coming down his face, when he announced these results, and he was so proud to announce those results. And he just said to the audience, most of whom were not Indigenous, he said, you think we can't do it? You just give us the funding, and our kids will beat anyone else's. And it was just an amazing occasion. And that's what can do, that's what can happen.
In the call to action for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, number 62 is often talked about. And it doesn't just call for the teaching of Aboriginal history or the teaching of the residential school experience. It also calls for the integration of Aboriginal philosophy and teaching methods into non-Aboriginal classrooms. And I wonder how you see that.
We're not going to make the kind of progress that we want to make until we get to know each other. And we don't know each other. And we can spend all the time we want in this room, but I think we really got to face up to it. There are some fundamental differences. These are not bad differences, they're just some fundamental differences. And so you've opened this up. as David Mulroney said, I went to St. Mike's. I am very proud of having gone to St. Mike's, and I studied philosophy at St. Mike's. It has been a massive benefit to me. So some of you who have studied philosophy at St. Mike's will know, clearly, I studied that line from Aristotle through St. Thomas to today. And I basically, at my time, it was just after the days when Maritain and Gilson would walk the sidewalk. This was a phenomenal period, as it still is with the Pontifical Institute, in terms of studying philosophy here. But we didn't only teach, Thomism. We didn't only teach the philosophy that one would expect. I mean, they taught Heidegger, they taught Fichte, they taught Nietzsche, we taught Kant, they taught all of the great philosophers. It occurred to me many years later, after I had the occasion to talk to a number of Indigenous, primarily First Nations thinkers, that at no point when I was at university and I was studying philosophy did anyone ever teach the First Nations worldview. Now we all understand that the Indigenous worldview depends upon the nation. For the Cree, it's going to be different than for the Lakota. For the Lakota, different from others. For the Inuit, different from the First Nations. But there is a core, and that core has an enormous, essentially, is about two things. It's about the land. It's about the water. It's about the world in which we live. It is, the classic example that Rupert Ross gives. It's that when we look at a tree, in a field, we see a trunk and we see some leaves. And when the First Nations person looks at a tree in a field, they see the wind, they see the birds, they see the grass around it, and they see everything. They have a holistic vision as to what it is that they're looking at, and that we don't. But also, we've got to understand, and Mr. Starblanket, I think you mentioned it a little bit when you were up here, there's a huge spirituality about it. The fact is that I always found a heck of a difficulty that those teaching us philosophy would say, this is philosophy, this is theology, and there is no link between the two. I must say, Father, I've always found there was a link between the two. And basically, even if you're talking about, I think, therefore I am, there is a link to what am I justifying in terms of, is there a supreme being or not? The fact is that there is among them, I'm talking about the First Nations, a spirituality that we have lost. It is a spirituality that talks about the grandfathers in the sweat lodge. There is a spirituality that probably talks about that God made all of this and that it inhabits every leaf. But the fact is, that that's not incompatible. That God inhabits every leaf, and that God created the leaves and the trees and everything. I see no reason why we were not able to make a compatibility between those two. But the point that I would really make is that we're not going to know each other until we understand the worldview and the perspective of the First Peoples. And don't think they're going to give up on it. I mean, take a look at what really happened. I mean, they came along, we imposed massive poverty on them. We tried to destroy everything that they believed, because we were worried that if they held on to what they believed, then in fact they were going to be a threat to all of us, or what they wasn't going to work. Well, the fact of the matter is, after everything we have done, the one thing that we put them into poverty, they haven't given up on their culture, they haven't given up on their traditions, and they haven't given up on their beliefs. It's one of the most incredible acts of courage that I have ever seen. And so my answer to your question, I'm going to give you one other example in this, but my answer to your question is, for heaven's sakes, if what we're going to do is we want to say we got to get to know them, then let's not just get to know them in the way you meet somebody in a grocery store, but let's understand what it is they believe. And now somebody is going to say, well, everything they believe is allegorical, right? It's allegorical. I mean, it's a pretty myth. Well, let me just say two things. If you bring in a scientist in here, And they tend to look at things holistically. We tend to segment. But you bring in a scientist and he'll tell you, yeah, I agree we should segment, unless he's a quantum physicist. You bring a quantum physicist in here and he is going to tell you that everything is universal. He will tell you that in fact that the spiritual view of the First Nations is that we are all the same and we are all masses of energy simply, and nothing disappears, translating from one to the other. He will tell you that that is in fact the basis of quantum physics, and quantum physics is not for nothing known as the mother, as the mother of all sciences. And so, I simply say to us, we're talking about coming together. We ask that people understand us. Well, I believe that the essence of our coming together is to understand the depth, the feeling, but more than anything, the sophistication of the Aboriginal worldview. Because it is not, when the first settlers came here, and from, coming from pestilent cities in London and in Europe, without, I don't think, much of a philosophical background, sure, they couldn't understand where the First Nations were coming from. They couldn't speak the language, but they didn't understand the depth of view. And my view is, what I would really hope, David Mulroney, is that at some point, somebody might bring the First Nations point of view here to St. Mike's and allow, because it's got to be developed. We cut it off too short, it's got to be developed. There you go.
I guess we're going to touch on aspects of history and also aspects of, I keep coming back to this touchstone of the Catholic Church itself. But a reverend who's also a survivor of residential schools said after the report came back that natives or Aboriginals were not the only people who suffered under the system. The perpetrators suffered, and they also need healing. And I wonder how you see that, because that's almost a convenient way to say, well, we're all victims in this, so we weren't so bad, we'll just all forgive each other.
Yeah, well, I got to tell you, maybe a different way of coming at it, because I don't want to be too hard-nosed here, but I have a little problem with the word reconciliation. If you do, if you and I get into a fight in a bar, you'd be there, I wouldn't, but if you and I, if you and I got into a fight in a bar and it was a fair fight and we both beat the heck out of each other, it would be a very good thing the next day that we reconcile and we basically shake hands. If you go into a bar and I come along with 5 guys and we beat the heck out of you for no reason, I don't really think I should forgive you. I think that if there's going to be a reconciliation, I got a heck of a lot to do, and there has to be an awful lot of understanding. I think reconciliation, and I think the fact that the reconciliation is in the Truth and Reconciliation, I think is an act of incredible maturity by the First Nations. I think what it really shows is that they are so far ahead of us in terms of what has to be done that it is simply not believable. And that people then turn around and they look at that with the truth and reconciliation is what they're asking for. And then they start talking about, I don't want to spend any money here, they're wasting money there. The way that you said, it's just nonsense. And I think it should be put in their face.
The commission was a remarkable process, but a lot of people have noted it wasn't done the same way as South Africa, where people were actually confronted. You had, people who had murdered people and their families coming forward to speak directly to those people. That's a process of reconciliation that I think is intensely meaningful and profound. I wonder if you feel that we kind of lacked that by never actually really holding anyone to account.
Well, I think we did hold people to account. I really do. I think governments have been held to account. I think that churches have been held to account. I think that I think we have held them to account. You're right. We didn't do it face to face. We didn't do it face to face because, the residential schools well, the last one was closed in '96. The bulk of the residential schools were closed by the time most of us became adults. And the truth of the matter is, most of us really didn't know that residential schools were actually occurred. I was at a phenomenal experience at the residential school in Brantford. I don't know if you've ever been there, but the one in Brantford, and they brought in some survivors, but they also brought in 3 ladies who lived 3 blocks away. At the time, those were residential schools, and they say they didn't know that it happened. Now the fact is that we didn't. But I hear what you're saying. If there were people who participated in the residential schools and who really were not prepared to express the huge regret at what happened, then I think absolutely that we should confront them. But I also think there are 2 other things, and I guess I want to start getting myself offside people here. The residential schools were terrible. Let there be no doubt about it. But so was the 100 years that preceded the residential schools, and so was the 100 years that followed the residential schools. And the fact is that while I'm not sure, I mean, if we could get those who did the residential schools, let's bring them in, let's sit down with them, and let's say what you did was an awful thing and apologize. But for God's sake, how about the people who fought Cindy Blackstock and what was going on in welfare? How about the governments, for God's sake, of which some of them are all part of, that underfunded those schools and allowed it to happen? I mean, I think that what we really got to do is to recognize that we have a lot to repair for what has happened in the last number of years. And I think that the time that we really got is to face up to that and do it. And if we do that, then I think that we'll have look, I'll tell you one thing. The residential schools were god-awful. But we cannot blame the residential schools for underfunding healthcare, for underfunding education, and for what is going on today. The only thing we can do about today is make it right.
I know you said you didn't want to get political, but you and I have talked about this before. The Kelowna Accord, which represented an almost unprecedented agreement in Canada. It's impossible. You did it twice. You did it on childcare, you did it on Kelowna. You got everybody together. And then it was undone. And I wonder how you feel about what some people might regard as 9 lost years.
Well, it was 9 lost years. What was truly remarkable about the residential school, see, I've got it in the brain. What was about Kelowna is that what we did is, well, just step back. Some of you know Phil Fontaine. Phil Fontaine probably has had more influence on my life than an awful lot of people. When we first sat down to talk about what we were going to do about the residential schools, I did not understand the healing process, the importance of the healing process. Somebody took me through it. I probably learned from one of the best teachers. He was one of the first people who ever went publicly about the residential schools. And what we really decided between Phil and myself was that there has to be a different way of the governments interacting. That historically what had happened is that governments had said to the First Nations or to the Inuit or the Métis, this is your problem and this is your solution. I said, let's meet together, and I'd spoken to the provinces ahead of time. Let's meet with the provinces, and the first question we're going to say, what are your problems? And then I made a deal with them that we would only deal with what they felt were the problems they wanted to deal with. And they then named the ones which you all know: healthcare, education, welfare, housing, clean water. And then the second thing I said, you tell us what the solutions are. And and we will not necessarily accept all of your solutions, but we are going to negotiate with them table by table. And then what happened was that we met. We asked them what the problems were, they told us, and we said, okay, and then we set up separate tables. Because the one thing that we recognize, and this is where the previous government failed so badly, there are over 640 communities in the country, First Nations communities in the country. Every one of them is a sovereign nation. Every one of them is headed up by a chief who insists on being consulted. Well, no government can deal with 640 communities, not if you're going to get into an in-depth negotiation. So what we did is we started the negotiation, and we would go for about a month. This is table by table, I wasn't at the table at this point. Table by table, education, everything else. Then it would stop. And they would go back to the communities and they would consult. And then they would come back 3 weeks later. They'd say, this is how far we've gone, this is what we have done. And they would consult. The communities would give them their input and then they would come back. That's why it took 18 months. It took because there was this constant break in order to do it. At the end of the period, we had come to an agreement. The agreement was that things like healthcare and education, which are divided provincially within the country, would be divided provincially among them, but this is all fed money, Ralph Goodale, who was then the Minister of Finance, took $5.1 billion and booked it right away. Because we knew we were going into an election, we wanted to book it so that the money was there, so that it would, when the new government came in, it knew it had to be there to be spent if in fact a new government was done. We then had the meeting where everybody agreed. And it was an oral agreement. People said, oh, what's an oral agreement? Well, an oral agreement happens to be the way the First Nations have agreed with each other for the last, untold number of years. What it essentially was a way in which we were going to solve the issues. The federal government said, we'll pay. So the only question that has to be is, how do you people want to see them solved? And there's no doubt in my mind that if Kelowna had been allowed to pass, that what would have happened was that in fact we would be 10 years ahead, that a kid who went into grade 1 at the time of Kelowna would not now be dropping out in grade 9. I think we would have made huge, huge progress. The one thing that the government, which walked away from it, said, well, it was an oral deal, it was a handshake deal. Well, let me tell you something. You just saw there was a decision made yesterday on the Canada Pension Plan, right? The Canada Pension Plan was in deep trouble when I was the Minister of Finance. And I met with the Ministers of Finance of the provinces, and we had a handshake on the Canada Pension Plan, and that handshake stood the test of time for 20 years. So you can make a handshake deal between governments. It should have happened. We lost a decade. And now what's very, very important is that the new government be given the chance to pick that decade up and make up for the lost time.
Can I ask you, in your personal life, what your relationships with First Nations peoples in Canada has brought to you, either spiritually or in practice or in your worldview?
Oh, it's had a huge effect on my worldview. It's had a huge effect. The discussion or the mention that I had earlier about what I have learned in terms of, as so many of us have been an environmentalist for a long time, but the perspective that I got from the First Nations on what we are living in, what this world is about, from one of view of what we have to preserve, has been augmented immeasurably by the discussions that I've had with Indigenous thinkers. Their perspective on the world has had an overwhelming effect on my view on what has to be done. And I will tell you something that's sort of interesting. David, I don't know, I don't see him. There's David. I spoke at the G20 meeting, pre-meeting in China. The G20 meeting is coming up in China in this fall, and they have pre-meetings basically to meet with the Sherpas and the diplomats and everything else. And I was asked to go over and speak to them about the G20. And it was not too long after that remember Obama and Xi Jinping have shaken hands on certain environmental things, and I was pushing the ocean very strongly. And I decided, because I was having some trouble at this one meeting, so I decided I would tell the Chinese what the indigenous view on the environment was. And I was amazed at the extent to which a number of people, one person actually stood up and he said, I understand this. It was phenomenal. I mean, the take-in, they said, I understand what you're saying. This is the way I see it. And I'll tell you, that there is something, I think there's something very fundamental among all of us that really reflects that worldview. We don't express it very well. And I think if we were to study it better, I think if we were to get into it better, it would have a huge effect on the way we look at the world.
When you look at the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I know you and I have talked about number 62, but are there others that stick out for you that are urgently important?
Well, I think clearly the most important in terms of urgency are healthcare, education, and welfare. I mean, my own view is, for heaven's sakes, government said they're going to do them all, but I think those three we're not going to make it. Right? We're 34 million people. They're the fastest growing segment of our population. We don't turn around healthcare, education, welfare, and we don't turn around it forthwith. We are not going to make it.
Are we on track to do so then? Because I know Charlie got up and very passionately spoke about, for example, applications going to the government about special health needs and coming back with not only no, but what was it, Charlie? Absolutely not?
I think we will on one condition. I think we're going to have to show success. Look, this is going to be a very expensive process. It's far more expensive than the money that is on the table at the present time. The money that is on the table is enormous. It's the biggest chunk of money ever to be spent in these areas, and I think it's a wonderful first step. But it is a beginning. And I believe the argument that says the highest return on investment is going to come from the money that's put into this. I'm not worried about doing it. I'm not worried about being a former finance minister and therefore, the heart of compassion. I'm not worried about saying, listen, put this money into it, because in fact, the return on investment is going to come back to you if you do. If you don't put the money into it, then you're not going to, then the decline is going to be faster than you think. So yes, the answer is that we can afford it, but we have to do it now. And then we're going to have to build on it. I think maybe the point that you're raising is I don't think I can tell you, in fact, I can have talked to them. I don't think we fully understand the trauma flowing out, see, we keep talking about the trauma flowing out from the residential schools. It's the trauma flowing out from poverty. That's a whole different ballgame, but that's a continuing trauma. It's not something that we're remembering because we inherited from somebody else. You put those generations living up in the Anishinaabe Nation. Well, I guess that's probably your writing. You take a look at the poverty that's occurring there. The trauma that causes is we're going to live with until we deal with that trauma. And that's going to require sophisticated help of the kind that it's beyond my capacity to describe.
Can we take some questions from the audience?
Sure.
All right.
Mr. Martin, we've talked about water and housing and so many issues, but we haven't talked about food security and the cost of food. Is that all wrapped up into healthcare? In my travels to the north, I could hardly believe that a head of cabbage was $9.99 when a bag of chips was $3.10. So I'd like to understand why and how the government could even begin to solve food security issues and how that feeds into the health problems. Well,
I don't think there's any doubt about how food security feeds into the health problems. The one thing is, that we all talk about the digital revolution. We all talk about technological revolution and how it's going to change everything. And how maybe jobs are going to be lost, but it's also going to make massive introductions. This idea of northern greenhouses works. There's an experiment going on in northern Ontario on one of those. The scientists have now said that if you look at hydroponics and how you're going to do this with all of these, there is no doubt that we are going to be able to produce food at a much cheaper level than what it's going to cost to grow it down south and bring it up there, and we can do it. The fact is, this is an area where Canada should lead the world. And there is no reason why, in fact, that this should not be done. So I don't think there's any doubt. You stated the problem. I'm not saying that you know, northern greenhouses are going to be every answer, but I can tell you one thing: there is no doubt that on a cost per unit produced, northern greenhouses can solve the problem of fresh vegetables. No doubt about that. It's just a function of doing it.
We should have stuck with the sprung greenhouse then. We just didn't wait long enough.
There you go. No, but you know, this is, let me tell you, it's the same thing with water. It's the same thing with all of these issues. The fact of the matter is there are solutions. There are solutions, and we just got to stop getting hung up on that there are none, and we got to stop getting hung up on the cost of doing this thing, and we got to talk about the return on the investment. And if you look at the return on investment, all of this is possible. All of this is possible. If somebody had initially looked at the cost of setting up the internet, if the Pentagon hadn't done whatever it did, God knows how many years ago, and then said, oh my God, we can't afford, we never would have had the internet. Well, let me tell you, the return on investment on the internet has dwarfed everything else. And it's about time that we start to use this kind of an attitude towards the kind of problems that we're talking about.
Mr. Martin, you spoke about poverty. Have you ever thought with the government and corporations to get together and perhaps bring some jobs to our communities, our Indigenous communities? Call centers are going to India, they're going to the Philippines. I'm sure our young Aboriginals are just as capable, if not more.
Well, John mentioned that we set up this investment fund that invested in things. One of the things that we invested in is, in fact, it's an organization called Indigena, which is a First Nations call center, precisely for the reason that we have done it. It's operating out of Tsawwassen, in the Tsawwassen Band in British Columbia. And so, you know, yes, there are these opportunities. They'll have to be cost effective. I'm not sure that all of them are cost effective with places like India, but you're absolutely right. All of these areas they can be done, but a lot of it's going to come down to the use of the new technology. One of the things I think we really have to do in terms of so much of Indigenous Canada is skip over a couple of things. I mean, we talk about education, we talk about distance education, we talk about digitization. Well, we don't have to wait for mainline schools to start to do it. There's no reason why the First Nations can't jump over the last 20 years and actually do this.
Do you think the government should set aside money for the youth, for the reconciliation, for culture loss, language loss? Because
for what kind of loss?
Cultural loss, language loss, because I've witnessed it firsthand. I got cousins and friends whose parents or grandparents went to residential school, and when they came back, they told their kids, you can't speak your language no more. We're losing our way of life over this. I notice kids don't want to hunt no more, kids don't want to fish, kids don't want to plant. That's just as important as our language. Without hunting, fishing, trapping, farming, that falls under cultural identity. So that shows who we are as First Nations. Do you think the government should set aside money for cultural restorations for different reserves?
I think that the government should set aside money for damage that has been caused, yes. Are we going to be able to return to the same hunting, fishing traditions throughout the North? Probably not. But should we do it where it can be done? Yes, we should. Do I believe that the government ought to recognize how your generation has been impacted by the things that your parents went through? Absolutely. But that's where I come back to. The answer there is trauma. The answer there is health. The answer is education. The answer is economic opportunity. And I think that absolutely has to be done. But it's got to be done in partnership. I think this is one of the other things where I would just have a little problem with what you said, is that I do not think that the government, will the government do this for me? The government do that? The government can do nothing unless it's done in partnership. If we don't do it in partnership, we're going to make exactly the same mistakes that we made for the last 200 years. But fundamentally, if you take the leadership, if you say this is what we got to do and you can demonstrate that it's got to be done, or we can sit down and say, can this be done, and we do it in partnership, then I think there's nothing that can stop it.
I can't, these things sound so great, you know, But the reality is that there's hungry children that exist in that community of mine and probably elsewhere. That, will never want to, learn anything because they're, it's all about survival. How are they going to get through the day, or how the parents are going to get through the day, to address, the shortage of food and the inadequate housing and inadequate health care. So do you think there's going to come a time when the Canadian government is going to release their hold on our natural resources as the indigenous people of this country and give it back to us so that the future generations to come will prosper and be educated, like you say, that's available?
Well, do I think the day is going to come when it's going to be all given back? Probably not. Do I think the day is going to come when reasonable partnerships are going to be established, that equity positions are going to be taken by the First Nations, that in fact the benefits of those resources are going to flow to those who live near them, or not just near them, but those who live within a very long distance, but nonetheless have the right to participate in it? Yes. Do I think that what we can do is turn that around? Absolutely. Do I also believe that it's going to take a lot of, not just leadership from government, but leadership from the First Nations governments for that to happen? And that's the other part of the equation that we don't always talk about. But yes.
Can I ask you if you feel, this is something I do at the end of all of my interviews, I always say, is there anything else? Do you feel like we've hit on every message that you wanted to bring today?
I think there's a recognition that the natural resources have been handled very badly, but we're not having a debate as to, okay, how do the structures work? What is a fairer treatment? What is a treatment that's going to basically create wealth in those areas? I think, did you say you're from Manitoba? Well, just take Cross Lake, Manitoba, where there is some mining potential that it isn't happening. I think that the debate, we're dealing with the debate at a level that is now well accepted, and what we've really got to do is to start to figure out how we're going to do it. I think that if we're going to be talking about health, for instance, there's got to be a lot more discussion on trauma and how do you deal with trauma. I think that when we're discussing, when we're discussing education, I think that we've got to be discussing, look, the single biggest problem in education in primary schools up north is teacher training, as an example, and we're not talking enough about those issues. I think we're spending far more time than we should talking about the problems and not enough time talking about the solutions. And I think that is really where the debate is going to take place. So it's not hard for somebody like myself, or I suspect Charlie, when he was here, to stand up in front of this audience and agree. I think the country's there. I think that the solutions are what we've got to be talking about, and that's going to require the First Nations, as an example, to be at the table, and to be at the table in an organized way. You can't negotiate with 620 individual nations. You've got to be able to discuss, and the First Nations are there. They've got it happen within themselves. So I think that's part of it. I will say one thing, though, to you, and if we're closing, I really want to say this. I want to say to David Mulroney, and I want to say to Father Bisson, this is a tremendous day. I sat there when you had the panel. I met with some of the school kids who were outside, and then I've heard the questions here. This would not have happened. This would not have happened that long ago. And that if you want to make people live, you want to make people understand this kind of thing, heaven, boy, let that happen here. Let it happen here and not simply in the House of Commons. Let it happen here and not simply, I see, Joe Norton is sitting here, who is an old friend of mine. And I'm sure when you go back to Montreal, as I go back to Montreal, we'll talk about this kind of a day. And we'll say, why isn't this happening elsewhere? So, Father, you're trained by the Oblates, trained by the Basilians. I really like the Jesuits. So so thank you. I think this is a great advance.
Thank you, sir.
Bonjour.
Bonjour.
Nando Ekwe, Nishakango. The name that I was given is Healing Woman. Bneshi Dodem, I'm from the Bird Clan. Mino Mokwa, Minadmoit, the bear is my spirit helper. And we Kwem Kung, Nidom Nising Donjaba. I'm from Manitoulin Island, Wikwemikong, unceded First Nation. And I wanted to say Chimigwech, Gabakidian, I want to thank you for all the words that you spoke and the ways that we can work together and the importance of education and having faith in our children. So I have something I want to give you. Now, we have, there was this porcupine that's been trying to eat my back steps at home. And every time he's been there, he's left me quills. But I did not have enough quills to make you the quill box, but this was made by, from Chiging, Manitoulin Island, Delia Baboning made the quill box, and it's decorated beautifully on the side, and it's trimmed by, oops, sorry about that. And it's trimmed by sweetgrass.
Really expensive.
Yeah. Sweetgrass. But this takes a lot of work to do, you know? And so it is quite expensive.
Well, look, thank you very much.
And it's on the cover here, you see, it's a turtle to symbolize Mother Earth, okay? And if you look at the map, you will see, if you look at North America, you will see the symbol of that turtle outlining the continent. And so there's this Mother Earth here, and as we travel together, we have to walk slowly on Mother Earth. And we do have that shell that's in front of us where we can hide, and we can hide those things, you know, those awful, awful things that have happened. But we need to look inside and have that be connected to that light, that connection to our Great Spirit, our Creator, and have that connection that will guide our way in this life.
Well, thank you very, very much. The only thing I would say is it was that porcupine that inspired you to give me this. I really like that porcupine. Thank you.